make something cool. And what I chose to do was this sort of like lecture demonstration thing, talking about how technology has affected timbre, or the sound of music, throughout the past, I don't know, 150 years-ish. So yeah. I guess the first thing to start with is timbre, which is kind of like, I feel like a slightly lesser known word compared to something like pitch and volume, but in my opinion is not necessarily any more difficult to understand or abstract. It's basically just the tonal quality of a sound, so anything that is not the pitch or the volume. And so a helpful way to think about it, I think I have two sound files here and you can listen to them. Oh, nice. So it's a violin and a trumpet playing the same exact note at the same pitch at around the same volume. But the reason they sound different and the reason our ears can pick up that they're two different instruments is because the timbre is different. And so I also believe that this exists on a macro scale, so beyond just two notes sounding different, two songs can have different timbres, two artists can have different timbres, two entire music genres have very different timbres, and what I want to go over in this presentation is how different eras of sound and different eras of sound recording also sort of have different characteristic timbres. So I feel like this is the loop that most people imagine, where you have a sound, or you have a song, or you have a certain timbre that influences our expectations of what we expect from our music, which then loops back around to what type of music gets created, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to say this is totally wrong, but I think there's more to it, especially regarding technology, which has a very direct effect on what sounds are created, what sounds are easily created, which ones are more difficult, and sort of the creative workflow, and just ends up having a lot of effect on what sounds end up being created. So let's start instantly. This is just a video that I think represents that a little bit, and how we have different emotional associations with different sound eras.
Old gear, there's just something magical about it. The imperfections and flaws provide character and warmth often missing in today's cold digital world.
Alright, that's all I'm going to play of that. Acoustic era. This is the very first era of sound recording, starting off in 1877 with the invention of I believe it was called the phonautograph, which for this entire like 50-ish year period, the concept of recording sound basically boiled down to like collecting as much physical vibrations from the atmosphere as possible and physically vibrating a stylus. And so, again, you don't have any microphones or a way to electronically boost the signal in any way. So all of these ended up having these really giant, goofy-looking horn things. This is like the smallest one, but they get much bigger than this. And basically just capturing as much sound as possible to vibrate a little needle. And this is a picture of like the actual physical markings on like a roll of wax paper, or like the very first one was like just like lamp soot or something like that. So yeah, the effect that this had on timbre is that you needed instruments to be loud enough to physically vibrate this stylus. And so even with these giant horn things, you needed really loud instruments to have enough physical vibration to have any meaningful signal in the recording. And not only that, you needed them to be mid-range in the frequency spectrum. So that means like no super low bass and no super high-pitched like flute or something like that. And so that's why I've written here, trumpet works really well, tuba, piano, wood blocks. But what ended up getting really lost was stuff like the double bass, which was like too low and too soft. Bass drum, which is also too low. and flute, which was just a little too soft and high. And I have a demonstration here, which there's a few things that I want to note. It's a recording of a piano sonata by Grieg from a long time ago. I think this is like 1903 or something. And I have it showing the frequency spectrum. And it'll show how anything below around, I think it's like 150 hertz is just basically pure noise. And same thing above around 2000 hertz. I don't know if you can see, but here's, let me see my cursor, yeah. Here's the numbers right here, and just take a look. So again, around that point, everything's just jarbled mess.
Whoa.
And so if you cut off all of this stuff and you get cut off all of this stuff, you're actually not losing much of the actual sound source that you're trying to record. You're just getting rid of a little bit of noise. Cool. Okay. Electronic era, which is once we start to get microphones and electronically powered loudspeakers and ways to play back sound in a meaningful way. And what's called shellac records, which is basically the precursor to vinyl, just kind of slightly worse in every way. Electronic era had a very interesting effect on timbre, which was that there was less focus on volume. And in fact, if anything, you have the opposite effect that you had in the acoustic era, where instead of everything needing to be super loud in order to vibrate the stylus properly, you actually need things to be a certain, like, you don't want to break the microphone that you're holding, and you also don't want it to be super loud anymore because it's going to be amplified. And so you kind of get the opposite effect, where you get this vocal style called crooning, which if you're familiar with like Bing Crosby or anybody like that, this sort of like very soft, low, intimate singing style, which I'll play in the next slide. But there's also new instruments, so electric guitar, electric piano, basically ways to create sound, modify sound, boost signals electronically, and the theremin, which is like the little hand thing where you create sounds by hovering your hand in the air. So yeah, this is a recording of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and I also have a few things to note about this one, which is you have a sort of similar frequency range. It's just a little bit wider now. So instead of 500, I think it goes down to around like 50, or instead of 150, I think it goes down to around 50. And instead of 2K, it goes up to around like 5K. You also still have a good bit of noise, but again, not quite as much. And then you also get that sort of crooning style where the voice is really soft and low, but also has been boosted to be the loudest and most present thing in the song. Cool. So even down here, you're hearing a little bit of the bass, but then below 50, there's really nothing. right there is when you start to just get noise around 5K.
Dare to dream really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind.
Cool. Also, real quick, if you look at the piece here, the main thing that you're getting emphasized is this mid-range. So again, the vocal is the loudest thing, which seems obvious, but actually will change in future areas. Magnetic era. So this is where we get to a lot of fun creative stuff, because now stuff is no longer stored on a as physical grooves on like a disc or something like that, but instead as these little like magnetic polarity markings on a tape. So this allows for a bunch of things. One of them is multi-tracking, which is you no longer need to just record one audio signal on one disc. You can record multiple across the same tape, which also allows for stereo. So we can have multiple audio signals as part of one song. And then we get studio consoles because now there's a whole industry dedicated to taking these recordings and making them sound better, basically. You can slice tape physically and stitch it back together. You can do all these funky effects that will be re-recorded onto the tape. And I'll show these now, actually. Yeah, there's a image of someone literally severing the tape. So now we're at a point where there's almost no noise, basically imperceptible. The frequency spectrum is about pretty much as wide as you want. The only limitation now is that listeners don't necessarily have that same frequency spectrum to listen back on. Subwoofers and stuff don't really become super commonplace until I think like the 90s or something. So you'll notice when we listen to the demonstration, there will still be a lot missing from the bass. And then also a lot of creative techniques such as flanging, which I'll show, layering, and editing. And overall, this lends itself to like a shift away from realism, which isn't not necessarily for all songs or even most songs, but in general, technology becomes no longer just a tool to record audio, but also a method to play around with the way it sounds. So yeah, here's a couple examples. This is there's this cool little device where you can hold it up to a magnetic tape and literally see these grooves, which represent, the sound wave. So this is 4 tracks of audio being recorded onto one tape. And then here is some tape flanging, which is one of the techniques from way back when. Ready?
Yeah, I'm just. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Speed up, speed up. Yep. So it's that kind of like frequency sweeping, like kind of thing that you get from having 2 tape heads sort of moving slightly out of sync and then moving back in sync, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Here's my demonstration for Magnetic Era, which is a Les Paul song. And again, a few things to notice, which is the singer, Mary Ford, her vocals are layered on top of herself. So again, kind of a shift away from realism or trying to replicate what, would be recorded in real life, because again, that's not possible if you're just one person. And also the fact that we still have mostly a boost in the mid-range, the vocals are the focus, and then, but the bass starts to creep up a little bit too, and starts to join as part of like the main thing to be listened to. but again, we also get a fall off at around 50 still.
Dear one, the world is waiting for the sunrise. Every road is covered with dew, and while the world
I'm not gonna do the whole frequency sweep thing again because there's basically no noise here. But I just want to point out that it does kind of stop existing around 10K, and then below around 50 is when there's really nothing.
is
And then finally is the digital era, which is from 1975 to now. This is when we start recording sound and storing it out into bits, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, has a bajillion different ways that it affects music. One of them being music becomes so easily transportable, recorded, shared. You can store cajillion hours of music on a single hard drive. And it becomes portable. So we get, the Walkman early on, but that quickly turns into, these like iPod Touch and like MP3 players and stuff like that. Streaming services become the main way to listen to music, rather than going to a record store and literally buying it from the store. And then DAWs and other sort of electronic ways become the main way that people create music. And so you get a lot of music today that doesn't even necessarily involve a microphone in any stage of the recording. And so a few effects on timbre here. One is that you get much sharper transients. These are transients right here, like the very initial click of like, say, a drum hit or a piano chord or something like that. When you have a digital file, that can jump from 0 to 100 instantly, rather than even with magnetic tape, it takes a split second for it to jump to that point. But it lends itself to making everything sound much clickier, sound much more digital, I guess is the best way to describe it. We also get to a point where there's no natural noise or natural distortion unless you want there to be. And then something that's called U-shaped spectrum curves, which is what we were talking about before in all three of the previous areas. There's been a focus on the mid-range and the loudest points. The peaks in the song have been around that like maybe 500 to 2,000 like vocal range basically. But we start to see a shift towards like sub-bass, and people really start getting obsessed with bass and lower frequencies, which we'll see in the demonstration. And same thing with the higher end, also ends up getting boosted a good bit. In a similar vein, everything gets louder, known as the loudness wars. This is an example of like a remaster and then a box set of the same LP, starting at a very reasonable dynamic range and then slowly starting to get pushed to its absolute limit. And then a shift even further from realism, where, like I was saying, you can have the entire song be recorded without any actual microphone or real life source. Okay. See the loud starts right here, and the bass goes all the way off the ground. Also, the last thing to mention about that is that the drums, again, are not necessarily real. And they're kind of intended to sound like, a bunch of people clapping or like a kick drum on a drum set. But the goal is not necessarily to make it sound as real as possible, but instead just to have the most sort of groove to it. So here's just a graphical representation of that, is that in classical orchestra, you get, you're peaking around here in the mid-range and then falling off by very quickly on the left and right side. And then it doesn't literally look like a U, but the amount that you're boosting is much more seen in the low end and in the high end. And yeah, that is my presentation.
Awesome. Any questions?
It's a little tangential, but did you go into the history of the development of the microphone at all?
Yeah. Let me see what I remember from what I was researching. Let's see. I think the first one was actually this might be wrong, so don't take my word for it.
Okay.
But you know how there's a bunch of different microphones, like dynamic and condenser
Sure,
and ribbon and whatever? I seem to remember the first one being condenser, I think, which surprised me because I feel like dynamic is sort of thought of as the most basic. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what else.
I think you had it listed 1925.
Yeah. I mean, it's, again, all of these are sort of general, and it's you get the invention of the microphone, I think in the early 20s, and then it doesn't become a thing. It being sort of marketed and becoming mainstream is again a few years later and a few years after.
Sure.
But yeah.
So I'm not totally sure what the newest in music technology is, but how do you think timbre is going to change in the future?
I feel like the trend of this is becoming less and less real. But I actually think whether that continues on into the future is kind of up for debate, because in my personal opinion, and this is semi-related to the presentation, we're sort of entering a point where we're rejecting that a little bit, the sort of digital life in a sense. And so I'm of the opinion that eventually we're going to start to see more in a similar way that you know how vinyl is making a comeback, that sort of thing, where we're sort of appreciating more the music separate from corporations, separate from digitization and stuff like that. So I think we're going to start to see the pendulum swing back a little bit in terms of just having recordings of people playing music in live settings. I think there's going to be a return of vinyl, as we were seeing before, that's sort of purposefully introducing noise, distortions, and imperfections into the music going forward.
What do you think that'll look like Timbre?
Timbre, I think it'll be a weird I don't think we're going to go backwards necessarily, because again, our expectations are influenced by technology, and our generation and every generation after is sort of growing up around a world that's filled with digital noises. And so I think that'll always have a place in music, but I think it'll also become something that'll, an artist's job will be to combine those with their own creative vision in a way that still sounds human in a sense, where I think in the 2000s and 2010s, for example, and you get dubstep or whatever, it's people were really obsessed with how digital it sounded, and that was so cool because digital technology and moving forward and digital progress was so sick and awesome. And now I think people are sort of tired of how fast everything's moving and progressing, and so I think there's a certain weird combination of being very influenced by digital sounds while also not necessarily wanting connecting with them emotionally. You know what I mean?
Yeah. To me, it just seems like we've gotten less dynamic.
Oh, definitely, yeah. That's what I didn't have time to sort of briefly touch on that. But with all the loudness wars and stuff, it's sort of when you're playing songs on the radio, the songs that get played the most are the ones that are the loudest. And so it's basically people just figuring out tricks to sort of push songs as loud as they can without distorting it.
Right.
And yeah, with regards to that, I don't really know if that'll. I mean, I think it's sort of started to fall off with streaming services and stuff, but
I feel like with loudness, there's both like the kind of supply side, like push towards more loudness, and the tools allow you to just crank the wave file like as high as close as possible to the limit. But then there's also the kind of demand side where people are listening in these environments where a low noise floor is kind of imperceptible. Like if you're listening on earbuds on a train, a dynamic recording is actually like super annoying because you just lose all of the quiet parts. So you're almost like blasting above this ambient noise as people are like listening on headphones.
that's a good point. Yeah, something I did in the mixing in Copenhagen that I was talking about. We did a listening session where I brought in a song that I thought was mixed so well because I would listen to it in my earbuds and it would sound like I was listening to it on 2 giant speakers. And I brought it in and we played it, and it ended up sounding. We played it on these like sort of nice like studio monitors and stuff, and it sounded terrible. And I think it's because like a lot of music is mixed specifically to be heard in earbuds, with the way that it'll like distort the kick drum and distort the bass in a way that like there's a lot of energy in the higher frequencies that like is really satisfying when you're listening to it just in your ears, because that's what it feels like to have really loud bass in real life. But when you're actually listening to a recording of super distorted like kicks or bass, then it just suddenly loses all its energy. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
I think as long as earbuds and headphones kind of become the main way to listen to audio, that'll always sort of be a thing.
I feel like there used to be a commercial of like luxury cars, like a Mercedes commercial, where people are like driving on the Autobahn and they're listening to like classical music. And the idea is like this car is so quiet that you can hear like all the subtlety of you know,
Yeah.
whoever playing classical music.
A noise canceling Mercedes.
Yeah. I've got a couple questions. I feel like this is a great presentation and a really awesome project, and there's so many different directions you could take it like from here. One, I was really interested in this kind of insight that you had about entire genres or artists or moments having their own kind of macro timbre, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, or identify some distinctions between artists who you feel like have different macro timbres. And in the one hand, like it's really easy to hear the difference between a 1903 like piano recording and like Dua Lipa, but within the same era, are there people who have different macro timbres so that you like instantly recognize the kind of sonic profile of one artist versus another?
Yeah, I think you could take, I think, literally any genre as an example of that. You could take you could compare, two saxophone players from jazz, and if you're an avid jazz listener, you're going to be able to tell. Same thing with rock. I feel like people who really love rock also like commonly can tell like what artist is playing just by the guitar sound and the guitar like note choices, stuff like that. For me, what I listen to a lot is just EDM, which again has a very similar thing that's sort of almost indescribable, but you can tell when you listen to an artist, the choices that they're making, you can be like, oh, that's G or whatever.
Well, and then subgenres of EDM are like entirely timbre distinctions.
Yeah.
Like this, like a 909 versus like what drum machine you're using.
Yeah.
Is basically just a timbral distinction of like one snare versus another, but that's the That's the genre.
Yeah, I had the 909 and the 808 in this presentation before I took it out, just as an example of like how technology is like, it defines entire genres often. Same way the electric guitar did, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I don't know what else I have to say about that.
Okay, my other question then, there's like this really interesting, you kind of, like the Les Paul and Mary Ford example, like Les Paul literally like invented the multi-track tape machine. So he's like the first person to use it. And he's already kind of bursting the door right open and creating all these techniques that then persist for another like 50 years or persist to this day. And that struck me as like a cool example of like somebody who right at the outset of a technological change did a lot of experimentation. And I don't know, have you come across other artists at like those other points where the eras turn over that like similarly just immediately gravitated toward the newest sound that could be made and made a style out of that?
I think when it comes to the digital era, I think people that do that don't get played.
Yeah, it's a little
I think
more
it's-
intense.
Yeah. I think in the first 3 eras, it's like so like cool and new, and people start using it in such cool ways that it's immediately sort of, there's an immediate pull to it. I did a lot of research in specifically the transition from magnetic to digital, talking about like all the stuff that went on at like Bell Laboratories was a name that kept coming up over and over and over again. Is like they did so much experimentation with what sounds could be made without a physical source. And so there's one is called there's an entire album called Music for Mathematics, which is in like 1960, I think, or something like that. And it's by I think it's by maybe a group of artists, I think, or by Max Matthews or something in particular. And I think people, like, there's a certain genre of people who are into music that get really like, whoa, like, into stuff like that. But in terms of like making it palatable to listeners that are used to a specific sound, I think the digital era was such a big leap compared to the other ones that it took a lot of time for people to like find the balance between those two.
Yeah, I was thinking you might also consider splitting the digital era up into a couple of like sub eras
I was
because
considering that too, yeah.
yeah, because the technology was around not all that long after the magnetic tape was widespread, like 1945 to 1960. But there was a whole, several decades where it was impractical and the bit depth was so small that it wasn't really a legitimate way of capturing music. And then even within there was a whole, the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, people were recording to tape and then bouncing that down to ADAT or some kind of CD, or CD was the ultimate destination of it. So they weren't necessarily doing all the DAW manipulations, but they were still recording digitally.
Yeah. There's what you said about bit depth and stuff, where computers then is you could have a multi-million, tens of millions, dollar machine, and basically all I could do was take in a few inputs and then spit out some a couple minutes of music or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's it's weird to think about because the whole recording live inputs or having it affect your sound in real time is something that computers just weren't powerful enough to do. So it ends up being tape and stuff. It becomes a weird middle ground for a while that I don't really know how you. Yeah. What's up?
Oh, I asked when did the DAW become, or you said it wasn't very accessible in the early stages. When did it become accessible for like anybody to like make music?
I think of it as like either mid 90s or like early 2000s when I think it was like Fruity Loops and stuff was becoming a thing. But I think the sort of it becoming mainstream in the sense where it's like that's a very popular way to just make music. Like this, like to the point where like the music production club at WashU makes sense to exist. I think probably doesn't happen until like, I don't know, like 2010 or something. That's what I imagine.
Have you put any thoughts on how the digital recording and digital techniques have influenced like current live performances? I'm mainly thinking about how like you used to get drums are being so loud and dry, like if you wanted to have read around them, you had to isolate them in a room. And now when you're just pumping into a PA system, you have a reverb. So now you can have like these sort of effects live. Things like that into
That's interesting. Yeah. I think live mixing is one of the coolest applications of that. It's like the combination of like turning a live recording into actual like polished sound, which is made much easier with digital era technology. You can EQ things like, I don't know if you guys know Jack, the audio engineer guy here, who like does all the live performances for WashU. He like has an iPad or whatever where he's like EQing stuff like on the fly as people are playing instruments up on stage. And again, adding reverb to sound like the reverb of like the acoustics of the room that's being played in, and delay and compression and everything like that. Which, yeah, I don't know what my point is for that, but it's very interesting and definitely a staple when it comes to live performances now.
Jumping off your point, Chris, I think it might be cool to look at some of those distinctions in eras between like how people consume music. You mentioned so much is done on headphones, or so I think that informed a lot of the temporal choices.
I think you're definitely right. Yeah.
Even like AM radio versus FM radio, I think there's a big distinction because FM had a, like probably you didn't get the bass filling out until FM radio was a bigger deal, which might have been not until the 70s. I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, I was just reminded during your presentation of this sort of epiphany I had over spring break, where I was sitting in a classical music, like a chamber music concert, and this new piece was being played, and there's this one part of the piece where it just felt really like metal, like it felt like heavy metal music, but it was like a clarinet and a cello and a violin and a piano, and I was just kind of like bopping my head, but it dawned on me like the only thing separating this moment from like a heavy metal show where there's like a mosh pit happening is basically like the timbre, you know what I mean? Also the volume, and also a tacit cultural agreement that like I'm not going to start a mosh pit in this concert, you know. But it was funny. I was like, this is way less subtle than what you guys were talking about with like a macro timbral identity separating like two similar artists or something. But some just musical genres are in some ways like so similar, but then they're like worlds apart, and it's really mostly due to the timbre, you know. Like obviously a distorted electric guitar is like such a different timbral profile than a violin, you know. So it's, yeah, but I mean, like you said, it's like not the primary domain we think of with music. We think about pitch and harmony and rhythm and all that, but it's also like so huge at the same time.
Yeah, I think that was something I also wanted to talk about in my presentation, was like the sort of arc that we're going through as a society, as technology gets more and more advanced. Is like, 200 years ago, we had the same instruments that we did 500 years ago, more or less. And like stuff like our ears were tuned to the sort of same thing continuously, and that led to more of a focus on like what exact notes were being played and what the harmonies were between those notes and stuff like that, and like the dynamics. And like when you look at Mozart, you don't say he was a genius because of the piano he used or like the type of sound that it was.
Right.
It's like because of the note choices and because of like the structure and blah blah blah. And so instead, I think it's like becoming more, like with electronic and digital stuff specifically, much more focused on like what the notes sound like rather than the complexity of like the harmony or pitches or volumes between different notes.
Yeah.
That's a great point. It like shows how music theory tends to privilege notey things that show up on a notated score, but people's sophistication for notes, like what pitch you're hearing and what rhythms you're hearing, even like highly trained musicians, like is not that good.
Yeah.
Whereas just about everybody has like instantaneous recognition of like the distinction between acoustic guitar in a country music mix versus acoustic guitar in a like, I don't know, folk music mix, or that's like almost subconsciously self-evident, because people are so good at just distinguishing these micro distinctions between in timbre.
Yeah.
But it's hard to like represent timbre, and so it's rarely studied.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think I was thinking about going there with my presentation as well, just about how timbre is like so infrequently thought about, despite being, in my opinion, like the most important aspect of what makes up a song's identity. And it's not something that's really taught in like, theory 1, right?
So how does this, like your findings in this project kind of shape what you do? Because I know you do a lot of really cool creative stuff, and like, yeah, I mean, you touched on some really interesting things in the presentation, like in addition to all the fascinating, more concrete things about timbre and sound production, but you talked about like the emotional quality that's, like an old recording. There's this like nostalgia that is brought into the picture if we listen to a recording from like the 50s, which is a whole other can of worms, but then you also mentioned like how at a certain point recording became more than just like accurately capturing a particular sound source, right? So there's a sort of philosophical can of worms there as well, but there's just so much interesting stuff in there, but I'm just curious how it's all informed what you kind of want to do creatively.
Yeah. Where to start? I don't know. I mean, I think the first thing is that like there's definitely like a sound design aspect to this presentation, which is like you can see the frequency sweeping and like which frequencies are boosted the most in these different eras, and where these like frequencies lie if you're trying to evoke a certain sound. And so it's like you notice that for very futuristic sounds, you're trying to go as far away from that sort of like mid-range as possible, and you have like in like a cinema, in like a theater or something, you hear really loud bass and you have really loud like higher frequencies, and the sort of it's the opposite of these acoustic era sounds, and so that ends up sounding very like futuristic. And same thing with like noise versus tonality, where it's like just a lot of like noise ends up sounding very old, and getting rid of noise ends up not sounding very futuristic. And so I guess specifically what I like to do in my music is sort of when we're talking about like contrast in music, a lot of it has to do with like contrast in volume or contrast in like pitches or contrast in like certain like song structures. But I think the contrast in terms of like actual like time in a sense, or like time periods, is really interesting. And so like I think music that sort of incorporates both to an extent and either like jumps between them or combines them in some sort of sense is really interesting, where you just like maybe have a first part that's like really muffled and like full of noise, and like you can barely even like make out what the melody is, like if there's a melody, like, and then it sort of like jumps to like perfect clarity or something like that.
Right.
And so like stuff like that is like, I think, really interesting for the same reason it's really interesting to hear a sound be really quiet and then get really loud, you know? I think it's interesting to get creative with the ways that you make, like create contrast, especially when like loudness wars and stuff, dynamics become a less common way to portray that contrast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. Any final questions from y'all?
Cool.
Great.
All right. Thank you,
Wonderful
guys.
job, Walter. Yeah.